In this video, I will discuss the novel Down the Rabbit Hole by Juan Pablo Villalobos. The novel revolves around Yolcat, a drug trafficker in Mexico, and his son, Tochtli. The main point that I'll be discussing is the author's choice of the narrator. The story is narrated by Tochtli, who is portrayed as a child with limited experience in life. Tochtli has several characteristics of a child that are evident throughout the novel. I find it interesting that of all the characters that could have narrated the story, the narrator chooses a child who makes grammatical errors in narrating and presents the story in a manner that reflects his young age. So why does Juan Pablo Villalobos choose Tochtli to narrate the conflicts between the drug traffickers and the government in Mexico? To answer this question, one needs to evaluate the characteristics of a conflict. A conflict has two or more sides holding opposing beliefs. If the conflict is described from one side or another, the story will be inherently biased and inconclusive. This is especially true in long-standing conflicts like those going on in Mexico. Over longer durations, beliefs become ingrained in the individual that any person involved in the conflict will be inherently biased. If the narrator seeks to offer an unbiased perspective that reflects both sides, neither of the conflicting sides can narrate. In this manner, the conflict can be observed more holistically. This is not limited to Down the Rabbit Hole, but is rather seen in multiple novels including Our Lady of Assassins by Fernando Vallega and The Vegetarian by Han Kang. In The Vegetarian, multiple narrations of the conflict between Young Hee and her family are offered in order to present a more holistic perspective which a single narrator won't be able to provide. Similarly, Fernando Vallega, in his novel Our Lady of Assassins, chooses an outsider to narrate the events in Colombia. An outsider would be more objective in describing the events, making the novel more holistic and less biased. In Down the Rabbit Hole, Tochtli is an insider, but he is a child that is yet unable to offer lengthy interpretations that are integrated between the lines. This makes him a receptive and objective narrator, as indicated by what he says. For example, rather than describing himself from his own perspective and saying, I am precautious, Tochtli says, some people say I am precautious. Tochtli also is very descriptive, as suggested by the enumeration that he continuously offers. He says, anyway, more people say I am odd. 7. These quotes portray Tochtli as a narrator who is describing his surrounding rather than interpreting it. In this manner, Villalobos leaves the interpretation of the novel to us rather than interpreting the Mexican conflict from one side or another. The descriptive nature of Tochtli narration is evident throughout the novel with statements like, we live in the middle of nowhere too, but we don't do it for inspiration, we do it for protection. Paul Smith pronounces his R's really strangely. Mazatzin says, that's what is called being a nationalist. Yolcat knows a lot about acting naturally. He acts naturally when he says the room with the guns and rifles is empty. All these quotes reinforce the reader's perception of Tochtli as a narrator that is not invested in the conflict, but rather an ideal observer. So what else does a child narrator add to the story? Aside from the unbiased perspective, a child is able to pretend and assume roles that an adult who has been molded into a certain identity by a society is unable to portray to the reader. A child pretends to be a doctor, a firefighter, or a magician, and through these roles creates his own identity. Rather than associating with his Mexican identity, Tochtli is able to play different roles. This gives the reader a more holistic perspective of the situation. As the child assumes different identities and imitates them, the reader is able to understand what roles such identities have on the conflict. From the beginning of the story, Tochtli says, I have a trick. Like a magician who pulls rabbits out of hats, expect except I'd pull words out of the dictionary, describing the hard words that he knows. This pretend play that Toshli engages in gives the reader a look at the impact of the conflict on the development of a child, while also enabling the reader to understand the Mexican cultural perspective on different concepts. If we were to understand how Mexicans feel about the French or drug trafficking, we have to place ourselves in their shoes. Toshli makes this possible by switching his role within the story and enabling the reader to relate to different roles that Toshli assumes. Otherwise, an adult narrator won't be able to associate with these identities, as the reader does not expect an adult to assume different roles, but assumes the adult to commit to one character that will be constant throughout the story. First, we see Toshli's perspective on his Mexican identity. Toshli says, Mexico is a disastrous country too. It's such a disastrous country that you can't get hold of a Liberian pygmy hippopotamus. Actually, that's what you call being a third world country. In this quote, two things are evident. First, the simple-mindedness of Toshli, as he is unaware of what a third world country is, which reinforces his presentation as an unbiased image of the conflict in Mexico. Second, the lack of nationalism in Toshli and his developing ideas towards Mexico, starting at such a young age. This presents to the reader a broader image of how Mexicans feel about their own country. Toshli later says, the best thing about being a king is that you don't have to do all the work. All you have to do is put on your crown. This is, yet again, another instance of Toshli experiencing with different identities and molding his image of himself. This is further exemplified by Toshli's collection of hats. Every hat gives Toshli the ability to take on a different role, which gives him the chance to narrate the Mexican perspective on different groups of people. A crown makes Toshli the king, and his words become the law. A sombrero, on the other hand, makes him experience being a charro horseman. This gives him the chance to experience being in such a role and relate to the reader his feelings about charros. Toshli says, if they are charro and macho, why do they sing love songs as if they were faggots? From all of these roles that Toshli plays, the reader can understand that Mexicans do not regard Mexico as an advanced country, that doing nothing while being able to give orders is something that is preferred by drug traffickers or considered as a life ideal, that charro sombreros are faggots if they sing love songs, and Honduras is not such a great country that anyone can impersonate a Honduran without being questioned. That solidarity and loyalty is appreciated among the drug traffickers.
If the author chose an adult to narrate the novel, the reader would only have access to what the narrator shares. Given that adults have access to the past in which they grew up, and the present which they're currently forming through their actions, the reader would be missing the essential link to the future developments which the author might otherwise want to share. So the question becomes, how does the author share information about the future if the parents or the adults do not have access to such information? The missing link here is a child narrator. A child narrator has access to the present through his objective observation and also access to the future, as the child is able to form the future through his future actions and his development. The child also has access to the past through the parent, which acts as an agent of socialization, teaching the child essential material for his development. This makes a child narrator superior to an adult for a narration of the past, the present, and the future. The reader will also be intrigued and given some room to think by observing how the narrator grows up and the impact that his development had on his future. What the author seeks to portray through this narration is the intergenerational propagation of conflict, moving the conflict from the past to the present and integrating it into the future through the socialization of the child. If an adult narrator was used instead of Tocqueville, we would only have access to the past and the present. Adults do not have an impact on the future as much as children do. The perspective of Tocqueville enables the reader to comprehend the past and the present through the narrator's interaction with the elders, take a peek look into the future, given the manner in which the narrator was raised, which is alluded to throughout the novel. Yolcott's interactions with Tocqueville exemplify this socialization process. Tocqueville says, "Together, Yolcott and I hung the heads on the wall in my bedroom." It is definitely not a common thing for a child to have a real stuffed animal in his room, nor is it normal for the father to help the child hang the heads up on the wall. This situation is presented merely as an action of socialization, the father teaching his son how to follow his footsteps, which encompasses a larger view on how conflicts are propagated. The samurai movie that Tocqueville watched with Yolcott presents another step in the process of socialization. Tocqueville says, "We had a lot of fun watching the film. At the end of the film, one samurai cut the head off another samurai who was his best friend, because he wanted to save his honor." This is followed by Yolcott saying, "One day you'll have to do the same for me." This alludes to the fact that Yolcott expects Tocqueville to kill him in order to save his honor as they pursue the drug trafficking lifestyle further into Tocqueville's life. Now, to summarize the choice of narrator and what that adds to the novel. First, it offers an unbiased perspective of the situation that is unaffected by the development of the conflict. Second, it offers a multifaceted exposure to the conflict, offering a more holistic insight into the situation, which is portrayed through Tocqueville's presentation, with his hats, and each hat representing a different role that he can take on and present to the reader. Third, a timeline of the conflict that takes a peek at the future by reflecting how the conflict might be propagated between generations. Thank you.